Now we're continuing on with lesson 1.2, and we're going to talk about more non-arguments. An explanation is one kind of case where you have multiple statements without an argument. The next one that I want to talk about is an example or illustration. I think the textbook uses the word illustration. I like to use the word example because you often see the word example in a passage or someone says that they're giving an example more commonly than an illustration. So example might have a stronger connotation for you than the word illustration. And very often, when someone gives an example, they're not trying to prove anything by giving the example. The example is intended as an aid to the understanding. So I might be talking about a concept that's a bit abstract or a definition, and I want to make it more concrete or familiar. And it's with that intention in mind that I offer you an example or illustration. So suppose I tell you that a deciduous tree is any tree that loses its leaves in the wintertime. Not a very difficult definition, but it's still sort of in the abstract. I could make this more familiar to you by bringing up examples. So I might say maple trees are deciduous, elm trees and birch trees and beech trees, while evergreen trees are not deciduous. Now I've introduced my example with the word so. And the word so can often introduce a conclusion. But again, these verbal cues serve many purposes. So doesn't always introduce a conclusion, just like because doesn't always introduce a premise. If you think about my motivation in bringing up the maple trees and the birches and so on, it isn't that I think I've proven that these trees are deciduous. Like, you weren't going to believe me that maple trees were deciduous, but then I give you the definition of deciduous tree, as if you were going to take my word for that. Instead, my motivation is that I've given you a definition in the abstract, and now I want to make it more concrete and more familiar. So I want to say, well, you're familiar with maple trees, birches, elm trees. Now it becomes something very concrete in your mind. You see those trees every year. So it looks like the motivation is clear enough. I'm giving an example as opposed to trying to prove anything. Now, as usual, with a lot of this material, there is a complication that arises. Whereas examples and illustrations are not generally arguments, sometimes an example can be used as an argument. And this is called argument by example. When somebody uses an example of something in order to convince you that that type of thing exists, then of course that's an argument because it's an attempt to convince. So think of something you might not have expected to exist. If I tell you that there's such a thing as a bank without an ATM, maybe you wouldn't immediately admit that that exists. So I need to remind you of an example in order to convince you that it exists. And I say, the World Bank is a bank, but it doesn't have any ATMs. So I offer you the example of the World Bank in order to convince you that there is such a thing as a bank without ATMs. I could even use the phrase for example. For example, the World Bank doesn't have any ATMs. And I'm still using the example to prove something. So that's an argument rather than just an example. And we might have an illustration, which is just a more elaborate version of an example. So far we have three kinds of non-arguments. We have conditional statements, and we have explanations, and we have an example or illustration. There's one more kind of non-argument that I want to discuss. And you're going to find that the textbook contains many more. In the textbook, we have simple non-inferential passages, and then we have expository passages. And you're going to find that simple non-inferential passages is then broken down into a number of other categories, such as a warning or piece of advice, statement of belief, and so on. But actually, the difference between all these categories is not so important to us. It's useful to keep these categories in mind so you can identify these things as not being arguments. But what they all have in common is that you have a series of related statements. These are passages that just tell you some stuff without doing anything special. There isn't anything that's a conclusion they're trying to prove, and they're not explaining anything or giving you an example of anything. So take an expository passage, for example. Instead of a conclusion, an expository passage will usually have a topic sentence, and the rest of the passage will elaborate or give details about the topic sentence. So, for example, you might open a science book, and you might find a paragraph that says, there are three familiar states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. And then it goes on to say that a solid maintains its shape and its volume regardless of the container it's in. A liquid maintains its volume but changes its shape to suit the container it's in. And a gas changes both its volume and its shape to suit the container that it's in. So this passage has a sort of main sentence. It's the first one, that there are three familiar states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. But that's not a conclusion. It's not like the person's trying to prove to you that there are these three familiar states of matter. You don't believe me? Well, a solid does this, a liquid does that. It doesn't make sense that they would be offering you these other statements as proof that there are three familiar states of matter. So instead what they're doing is they're going into detail about it. And this is an expository passage. Now, when you have simple non-inferential passages, this is essentially the same thing, only shorter. Somebody just tells you some stuff. They don't try to prove anything. They don't give an example of anything, or try to explain anything. And again, the textbook divides this up into a whole bunch of different categories, but the differences between these aren't really very important to us. So somebody gives you a piece of advice. They say you should have your house inspected for termites. Now, there's no argument there for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, there's only one statement, which we've already talked about. One statement can't be an argument. But even if there was more than one statement, if the person said you should go to Terminex or something, it still isn't an argument because they're not trying to give you a reason to believe anything. They simply state their advice, and you're supposed to trust them or something. Now, one idea that I hope you don't get from this is that these categories are somehow exclusive. We don't mean to say that if you have a piece of advice, that's it, there can't possibly be an argument in there. Somebody could give a piece of advice, and then they could argue as to why you should take that advice. I could say, you should have your house inspected for termites because there have been a lot of termite infections in your neighborhood or something. So now I'm giving you advice, but I'm also giving you an argument. I'm giving you a reason to believe that my advice is good advice. So it's not like it's some kind of automatic exclusion where if something's a piece of advice, then it must not be an argument. It's just that very often someone gives a piece of advice without giving any argument why you should follow that advice. They simply tell you, here's my advice. So when we talk about this category not being an argument, really what we mean is that sometimes such things occur without arguments. In fact, quite often. So maybe we should add into our description of this category that it's a piece of advice without argument. And I would say the same thing about all of these other categories. A warning is often stated without an argument. A report is often made without an argument. And in particular, I worry about the category of statement of belief. I hope you don't get the impression from that if someone's stating their beliefs, they can't be arguing. If you give an argument, then hopefully, unless you're lying, the conclusion of your argument is something you believe, and so are the premises. So you are stating beliefs when you argue. The categories are not exclusive. The point is just that very often someone simply states a number of things they believe without any argument. So, someone might say, I believe in freedom, I believe in democracy, I believe that Americans should be promoting democracy around the globe. And they simply say these things. They're not trying to provide any reason why they're true, but stating their beliefs is supposed to, maybe they're trying to rally people who agree with them or something like that. But I wanted to point out that any of these things could be done with an argument. It's just that often they're not accompanied by an argument. And I would say the same thing about loosely related statements. You can have loosely related statements without an argument. And this brings up a point about arguments that I think I mentioned before, and I want to just relate it to this issue of arguments versus non-arguments. When you have loosely related statements, sometimes the topic could make you think that it's an argument, or the tone might make you think that it's an argument. But the tone doesn't make something an argument. And I've mentioned before that the topic doesn't make something an argument. Don't think that something has to be an argument because of the topic, or don't think that it can't be an argument because of the topic, or because of the tone. If the tone is very kind of insistent, you can imagine someone sort of pounding a table and saying these things, that doesn't make it an argument. Or if the tone seems like you have a passage in which the author's tone suggests that they're speaking from a place of wisdom or something, that doesn't make it an argument either. There's a good example of this in the textbook. It's a passage from the Tao Te Ching, an ancient Chinese text, in which the author says, not to honor men of worth will keep the people from contention. Not to value goods which are hard to come by will keep them from theft. Not to display what is desirable will keep them from being unsettled of mind. And it has this tone where you get the impression this comes from a place of wisdom, that this guy is saying he knows this. But that doesn't make it an argument. If you look at these statements and think of the relationship between them, none of these seems to be offered as a reason to believe any of the others. They're three independent statements. So the tone doesn't make it an argument, and neither does the topic. Now again, the difference between all these different categories is not so important to us, although this can help you to identify something as just a non-argument. What all these things have in common is it's just saying a number of things. So at the end of the day, we could just label all these things series of related statements. And it's sort of like an other category. Either you've got an argument, or you've got an example or illustration, or you've got an explanation, or you've got a conditional statement. And those are all special things, special motivations a person would have for saying things. And otherwise, they're just making a number of related statements, either telling a story or giving you some advice or describing something in detail to you. Any of those kind of motivations we could just put under the category of having a series of related statements. Now that leaves us with 5 categories. That simplifies things a bit from what's in the textbook. Either something is an argument or it's one of these other things. And I do recommend thinking first about whether a passage is an argument or not an argument. And then if it's an argument, you can identify the premises and you can identify the conclusion. Actually, a lot of times the conclusion is the first thing that you notice. And once you decide that it's not an argument, then you can make up your mind about which of these other things it is, whether it's conditional statement, explanation, example, or illustration, or whether it's just a series of related statements. A lot of times that's the most helpful way to go about identifying these things, although not always. Sometimes it might be immediately obvious to you that you have an example or illustration, or immediately obvious to you that you have a conditional statement or explanation or whatever. But in any case, as of now, we have 4 things that we want to distinguish from arguments.